on our YouTube channel. But don't worry, you will not be recorded. It's only recording those of us who are unmuted and speaking. So as long as you stay muted, you won't be picked up by the recording. That means that if you have any questions at any point in the evening, questions for our authors, please type them into the chat and we will save them up, and David and I will pose them for you at the end. So please use the chat box for any questions you have. And then last but not least, before I welcome our authors, a thank you to all of you. It's been a long and hard year for independent businesses, bookstores, and others. And we couldn't be here doing events like this without all of your ongoing support. So thank you for sticking with us and helping to sustain us through this crazy tough year. Those are the boring notes. Tonight, I am so pleased to be the one who gets to welcome Tobey Pearl to Northshire Live to talk about her debut work of nonfiction, Terror to the Wicked, America's first trial by jury that ended a war and helped to form a nation. She earned degrees in law and international relations from Boston University and studied international law at the University of Hong Kong, and she's practiced law and taught at Emerson College. We're very lucky that Tobey will be interviewed tonight by her husband, fellow author Matthew Pearl, the award-winning best-selling author of the novels The Last Buccaneer, The Dante Club, The Poe Shadow, The Last Dickens, and The Technologists. His most recent book is The Dante Chamber. Please join me in welcoming them both to Northshire Live.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. And I'll, I guess, do a tiny introduction just to say that this is really Tobey's event, and I just get to kind of moderate. So I want to make sure that it's mostly Tobey's voice, but want to extend our thanks to everyone who's having a chance to tune in. And I think we're all still getting used to virtual book events, but they definitely have advantages that we get to share with people beyond the spot that we're in. And so I'll just be asking some questions to Tobey, and of course I think I know the answers to all of them or most of them. And then I think we have well, in this format, I guess, Rachel, would people enter questions in a specific place, or we would just ask for questions?
People can type questions into the chat at any point as we go.
Okay.
And David and I will keep our eyes on them. And at the end of the evening, at about 6:45, we'll come back in and start asking those.
Okay, great. So please think of questions, type questions, and we could get started. I just want to hold up the book that is just newly published, Terror to the Wicked. I'm so proud of Tobey's incredible work in this book, and that I got to be next to her and looking over her shoulder as she was working on it. So maybe we could just start with Tobey getting to just tell us a little bit about what the book is about and kind of what the story is that it tells.
Absolutely. And I just want to echo Matthew's thanks to everyone. I know Zoom is not easy and the pandemic is not easy, but books, at least for me, have been a constant and have been a little bit of a reprieve. And I hope sharing this book will be not only informative, but a little break in an otherwise difficult time, both for bookstores and people. And we're just very grateful for all of you who've turned out, and thank you. So Terror to the Wicked is the true story about a cold-blooded murder that took place in 1638 outside of Plymouth Colony. This took place on the outskirts of the settlement in a wooded area and a trail. And it was 4 escaped indentured servants who had been living in Plymouth Colony proper, who departed during the night and set out on this trail heading south. And they attacked and murdered a Nipmuc tribesman who had been on a trading errand for the Narragansett. He had just completed his trade at the Uptuxet Trading Outpost. And he, the murder victim, who's called Pinawanyanquist, was heading back on this wooded trail He had traded beaver pelts, which were very valuable at the time, for wampum and some other goods. And as he was traversing the trail, he encountered for a second time the 4 escaped indentured servants, who were kind of led by a man named Arthur Peach. And Peach attacked the Nipmuc trader, and incredibly, this man who was called Penawanyanquis escaped after the attack and survived long enough to identify his killers to none other than the founder of Providence, Rhode Island, Roger Williams. And that set off a remarkable chain of events that included a manhunt through the woods, and one of the most significant jury trials of the era.
So I thought it would be interesting to talk about how you discovered the story for originally. And I actually have a little part in that, because actually this is a good recommendation if anyone's ever looking for a present for anybody. I bought Tobey as a present a membership to the New England Genealogical Society, and that can be anyone. It doesn't have to be someone in the Boston area or in New England. It's, I think, I'm making this up, but I think it's probably one of the world's foremost genealogical organizations. It's not restricted to New England. And when you buy, there's a specific package you could buy someone for a birthday or a holiday, and it comes with some degree of genealogical research that the society does for the person that you're getting the gift for. So it's a really unique gift to get for someone, especially someone like me, like many people who have an interest in their family history, but never feel like they have the time or energy to actually research it, right? And I got that for Tobey, and part of Tobey's family comes from Bermuda. We have some Bermudians, I think, on board today. Part of her family comes from New England all the way back to the Mayflower. And I think that was the part that first led you in this direction. So maybe we could tell that story of discovering the story.
So Matthew is absolutely right. This journey, writing my book, very much began and had its very deep roots at NEHGS, which is New England Historical Genealogical Society. Anyone who's done genealogical research has probably heard of it. It is a world-class destination-worthy institute for genealogical research, but beyond that, they are a wonderful resource for a lot of New England history. And Matthew gave me this membership. It was after the birth of our 3rd child, and that provoked kind of an interest in piecing together our family. And that became a journey in and of itself. And I knew on my father's side that my family had deep roots south of Boston. And I had realized that I was probably the first member of my family on my father's side who had grown up outside of the area around Plymouth Colony. So in almost 400 years, I was kind of the first one not to be in that immediate vicinity of kind of the South Shore area of Boston. And I was curious about all of it. I mean, well, you know, I see my mother, hello mom, who is an immigrant to America and came from Bermuda via relatives in Spain, via Cuba, and had such a different story. But I was, as many people are, curious about all of it, and kind of ended up doing this deep dive into, at first, genealogy, and then quickly discovering a relative on my father's side, who a great-grandfather many times over was the governor of Plymouth Colony. This genealogical project became a history project, which became a book. And what I quickly realized was this colonial era governor was the judge at one of America's first jury trials, this landmark jury trial. And it was the criminal murder trial of the 4 escaped indentured servants who murdered Penawanyanquis. All four were tried. One was tried in absentia. He escaped to Piscataqua, present day, if you think about like Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Strawberry Bank area. But so anyway, it became a quest to kind of piece together the jury trial that I had this distant family connection to.
And I think I'm remembering this right. So the idea is that back then in the colonial time, if you were the governor of a colony, you were also presiding over the court, the very few comparatively court cases.
Right. So this is different from what we see today. At the during that period, the governor would have taken this role as judge at the murder trial. And not only that, but when we think about a judge today, it's a neutral who presides over the court proceedings. But you could imagine a judge in the colonial era as a judge you might see in a European court, who's a much more kind of aggressive fact finder into whatever cases unfolding in front of them. So that was different. And one other challenge in that era that I'll highlight was the reality of piecing together a jury trial. You see Roger Williams beside himself at the idea of having to put on a jury trial in fledgling Providence, Rhode Island. He did not yet have a charter from King Charles I, who was ruling over England and beyond at that time. So there was this kind of scramble of where can we hold this jury trial and will it work? Will we have enough jurors? And at the time, 1638, the population of Plymouth Colony was very small, quickly being dwarfed by Mass Bay Colony, present day Boston, both economically in terms of trade and also just in population size. So Plymouth Colony had about 550 people. And of course, women were not eligible to serve as jurors at the time, nor were indentured servants, 17% of the population. And people like Miles Standish, who was in charge of the military, other colonial leaders were not eligible for conflict of interest reasons. So there was a bit of a question mark from a logistical standpoint. Could this jury trial even happen? And I think what I became most as a former attorney, someone who used to practice law, and as a one-time juror myself, having served on a jury, I became really curious about why in 1623, at kind of in the early inception of Plymouth Colony, why were people so passionate about the right to have a jury trial? And when we think about democracy and rights that we have today and things that we cherish as Americans, and we think about free speech or the ability to vote, or perhaps we think about the right to bear arms, those things were very different then. You had people escaping persecution and torture for their religious beliefs. And in the colonial era, having a firearm was a privilege. It was not a right. There was no such thing as free speech. There were Puritans who would be up in arms if you said something inappropriate. And but they cherished the right to a jury trial. So you see William Bradford in 1623 in the middle of winter, in the throes of starvation, writing down the order that we're going to be a settlement who relies on jury trials. And if you think about, if you're someone who has experienced tyranny, your last line of defense would be your neighbors, 12 people who might stand up and say, we're not going to allow this injustice on our watch.
And speaking of the laws at the time, that's, I think, the very profound part of this case. But there are also very quirky laws from the time, like, I'll probably oversimplify this, but it was basically illegal to be single. Singlehood itself was essentially outlawed.
Right, no, that's absolutely true. And you see so many different groups, but it was absolutely true that at the time, and it's an irony that I really try and pull out in the book, that you have a group of people who very much cherishes this hope of justice, equitable justice, and at the same time, ironically, unwittingly chip away at the very right that they're trying to sustain and nourish when they say, if you're single, you're not welcome to this right. If you are an Indigenous person, you're not welcome to this right. And in this case, the murder victim was an Indigenous man, and he was a member of the Nipmuc tribe. And you see the settlers pulling together with Indigenous people to make this trial happen. And one fact I neglected to mention is that these events unfolded against the backdrop of the Pequot War, which lasted from 1636 to 1638, ending a few weeks by treaty after the verdict of the jury trial.
And going back to Thomas Prince, so that's the governor of Plymouth that you're related to. So I think as you researched him, he was both really interesting, and also, as you would always expect from someone in a different time period, he's an imperfect person, right? There were things he did like helping pursue justice. There were other things that we would look at through our lens and be more critical about. And I thought one of the funny things is that you didn't get to really, you mention it in the book, but you didn't really get to mention it in relation to you, is that there was a curse put on Thomas Prince and his whole family that would, I guess, apply to you and our kids, not me, I think, but the bloodline through Thomas Prince. So that's an example that brings up some of the friction that the settlers were prone to creating with other groups. Is that Prince curse?
Right. No, that was kind of one of the more intriguing pieces of genealogical research, was to stumble upon this family curse and kind of try and process this unlikely curse on our family.
But do you want to say a word like that was from his treatment of Quakers, right?
That's absolutely right. So he was someone who absolutely had no tolerance for Quakers. You think about these very rigid views of religion that the Puritans held. And that was kind of the tricky fine line of weighing the idea of telling this story. I thought that there was such an important story about nation building and the building blocks of democracy and why we value things like free speech and a judicial system that's functioning. And when you look at the Pequot War and you see what Mass Bay colony soldiers did as aggressors against the Pequot, it was very hard to piece together what part of our kind of deeply flawed origin story is worth pulling out here. And I think there were layers in writing this book, and I think it's very, very, very important to kind of turn that bright spotlight onto the darkest pages of our history. And the Pequot War is one of those frequently forgotten pages of our history book. And its legacy rings true today in the most challenging ways imaginable. And I encourage anyone who's interested in more detail on the topic to check out the Mashantucket Pequot Research Center, which is an invaluable resource. And so I felt it was kind of important work to kind of shine that light both on the very, very, very deep shortcomings of the people who lived during this era, and also kind of highlight what they aspired to do, what they were trying to do for our democracy, the torture and persecution they had faced, that they had struggled with, that they were trying to escape, and yet that deep irony of replicating the same problems here, and hoping that our judicial system can be as imperfect as it often is, that ultimate safeguard, especially when we see acts of tyranny around us today in recent years that have touched so harshly on our most precious democratic institutions.
And I think one thing that is so special for me about reading the book as you were writing it and then in its final form is it brings all that history together, but through a real page turner, because what's happening in the story is that there's a murder mystery. You know, this American Indian trader has been murdered, and no one knows why or who did it. And depending on the answers to those things, all kinds of calamities could unfold. And just a footnote, I think a lot of us grew up being taught to use the term Native Americans, and the shift has been a preference back to Indians, or American Indians, interestingly, or using a specific tribe. So just to share that note about the terminology. So one of the things you get to do is really bring the Indian figures to the foreground, because once the victim is found and he survives, but then ultimately he passes away, the characters in this case, real people, have to become investigators. And that's, I think, one of the most interesting parts about this is both settlers and Indians coming together to investigate. And I think one of the most powerful of those figures is a young boy, a young Indian boy of the Pequot tribe, I think it is, named Will, who's really never been written about. And it's kind of the first time he gets a spotlight on him is in this very exciting way where he becomes almost a hero.
Right. No, this is kind of the research find I am proudest of, and it took, as Matthew knows, a very long time to uncover, and it was actually Matthew's encouragement to keep going back, because the sources are scarce for this period. There's just not a lot out there, and to keep going back and rereading the archival sources, the primary sources that do exist. And I was mentioning this before, but this one passage written by Roger Williams, I read hundreds and hundreds of times, trying to really take a look at each word he used to describe the murder, to see if there was something else that I could research and delve into, and bring to a reader, because I wanted the book to be very narrative, and I wanted to profile in every way possible each historical figure. And sometimes, oftentimes in histories, women, children, people of color, Black, Indian, historical figures are left out of the story, and archives leave so many people out of our histories. And I wanted to do everything I could to kind of bring all of the players who were involved onto that stage. And so as rereading Roger Williams' description about the murder, I finally realized, after going back to it over and over and over, he mentioned a messenger pursuing after the murderers through the woods. And I realized there's someone here in all of the academic papers I've read that have been excellent, but this messenger has never been identified. And I began digging and piecing together and reading everything that Roger Williams had ever written. And it took a while, but when I realized who the messenger was that had been pursuing after the murderers in the woods, it was, as Matthew mentioned, the least likely person I ever could have imagined. It was a little boy, and his name was Will. Governor Winthrop of Mass Bay Colony named him at Roger Williams's request, and I estimate he was about 10 or 11 years old, because members of the Pequot who were male, who were older than that age, had been sent to Bermuda during the Pequot War. And the idea that it was a little boy who had helped secure the capture of these 4 adult men, these murderers, was so remarkable to me. And I think sometimes we look, and the heroes that were given in the history books that we read growing up are of one sort. And meanwhile, we know that the reality is that so many people have been part of that fabric of our history. And I was very, very happy that I could bring out Will's story and do some research into Will's background. And so that was something that was kind of a fascinating research discovery and moment, and led to all the more research, which was fun.
And I see one just request for us to talk louder,
sure.
so we'll do our best with that. So, and speaking of research, this was because we were in the Boston area, you got to go to pretty much everywhere in person. I remember one funny instance in which some of the historical documents were being kept not in a library or an archive, but in the town registrar's office. It's just where they ended up, and they wouldn't let anybody see them. Not for any particular reason, just because they weren't a library or archive, so they had no process to share them. But you did get to see those.
Yes. No, this is kind of a funny story. It was the Plymouth County Registry of Deeds, and remarkably, they are the record keepers, the holders of the Plymouth Colony records. These are all of the records kept by the Plymouth Colony settlers. And I went to the Registry of Deeds, and they did have this one page of parchment. It was Bradford's order requiring the use of jury trials. And but they said you have to be an attorney if you want to see it. And I was there as a researcher, and I said, you know what? Actually, I do. I have my bar card, which is the card that they give you when you're an attorney, and you can use it to kind of skip the line at court. If you're going into court for the day, you don't have to go through security if you have a bar card. So I was very fortunate. I had my bar card, and I was able to see the document that began the use of jury trials in this country. And I realized at that point that it was a treasure, and it's normally tucked away in a fireproof vault in the Plymouth Colony Registry of Deeds under lock and key. And I was probably one of the few people in the world who's ever gotten to see it. So I felt very fortunate, and it inspired a lot of my book. And the circumstances under which it was written, I thought about myself. If I had been in a survival situation, half of the settlers who arrived in Plymouth in 1620 died the first winter. And this order was written in 1623 during a hand-to-mouth existence of starvation. And I just became very intrigued by it, and I thought it was important enough to try and share. I worked with a wonderful local photographer who went back and was able to photograph it, and there's an image of it in the book, so that now it's no longer kind of kept away under lock and key. Anyone who's curious can either buy the book, check it out in the library, and see for themselves what someone in that kind of survival situation who cared so much for the idea of equitable justice, the lengths that they went to try and offer that.
Yeah, it's many of you might also have subjects that you research from history, because obviously most of us here are interested in history in one form or another. And it is a funny thing that there's no kind of unified standards about access to materials. And you do run into these very odd restrictions, whether formal or informal, on material. And there's not much recourse to it. So that wasn't a very strange example to be told as a writer, that you have to be a lawyer to look at something. Or I know a writer recently who was researching Chinese American history in San Francisco, the building of the railroad, and there's a museum there dedicated to that. And the writer is Chinese American, but they wouldn't let her. You had to prove that you were a descendant of some of the people whose papers they had, which is completely outlandish. I mean, we wouldn't be able to write books, we wouldn't be able to research articles or history if you had to prove like your bloodline related to the papers. So it's a funny thing when you're researching history. It could be from hundreds of years ago, to find these usually very random barriers to entry sometimes. But I remember, because we would come along with you for research. I remember we went to the Plymouth, the kind of reconstructed Plymouth village with our kids. And it was nice to combine visiting and having the kids learn about things, And I remember kind of a very surreal afternoon where we were doing that, and you were taking notes and looking around, and we were putting, I think our youngest at the time was a baby, we were putting her in the reconstructed crib, which you were allowed to do. It wasn't an original crib, but that looks like what it would have looked like in the 1620s. And I remember the people dressed in garb we lost one of the kids, something that belonged to one of the kids, and they weren't allowed to help us look, but you could tell they wanted to, but they weren't allowed to break character. But the book is dedicated to our kids, and maybe that's a kind of a topic worth mentioning, which is that this is the first thing you've written, and you did it while we had still have very young kids, but even younger when you started. And maybe saying a few words about that balance, which sometimes combined, kind of intersected with each other, of working on your first book project and having 3 little kids around.
Well, it was a pleasure, and writing a book is a very flexible process. It might take many hours, but there are hours you can put in while they're at school or while they're asleep, or they're flexible hours. So I felt very lucky as a parent to have this opportunity. I know that the pandemic has been such a terrible setback for a lot of workers, and especially has kind of hit women very hard. And I hope some of the platforms we're enjoying now can hold over post-pandemic, because I know for anyone who parents, and Matthew and I have kind of leaned on each other and had the same juggle. And we've actually turned a challenge into a positive. We've both brought the kids on research trips. And I've had our oldest son with me at an archaeological site that was trying to reconstruct one of the battle scenes of the Pequot War. And it's been a nonstop adventure. And I think that's part of what history is. There's good and awful, and it all has to be brought into the classroom and into our narrative of where we come from and into our daily conversations. I think it's so important to kind of get history back into the conversations we have with each other. And so it was kind of a wonderful win-win that we were able to teach our children so much and enjoy researching with them by our sides. And the details that they noticed along the way only brought more magic to whatever we were researching and writing, because they're able to pick up on the smallest details that we may overlook. And especially the period I was writing about, I mentioned that half those settlers died over that first winter. The remaining folks were by high percentage children. And you see, especially in a time of war, children doing remarkable things that you would never imagine. I mentioned Will and how he tracked down these 4 grown men who are murderers. Arthur Peach, the ringleader of the group, had been a battle-tested soldier, both in Europe and then also in the Pequot War. And when Will, after he was able to complete that mission for Roger Williams of helping to apprehend the murderers, he then had to bring a message from Providence, Rhode Island to Mass Bay Colony, present-day Boston. So anyone who's familiar with the area, he would have traveled on foot. Horses were very rare and prized possessions at the time. Mishoon or canoes were in common use, but all likelihood is that a boy of his age traveling alone would have been traveling on foot for 40 miles. That means an overnight, if not 2 overnight breaks in that trip, and he's traveling alone. So it was fascinating to me to have children by my side who were doing incredible things. I was very lucky that the archaeologist who took us out with a larger group on this to this archaeological site in the woods in Connecticut, that having my son right there, he got to ask some questions, and it was a learning opportunity, and it was eye-opening to kind of see what a child might take away from a situation, and to try and envision what the children of that era were surviving, which was remarkable and hard to even imagine.
And I think maybe we'll start integrating some of the questions. If anyone wants to add any in the chat function, or Rachel, do we also ask people that they could just ask the question verbally, or?
And we generally prefer to use the chat.
Okay, the chat, yeah, just
for
to
the
keep
recording,
it.
so we don't accidentally
Sure,
record
sure.
someone and they
Yeah.
wind up on YouTube.
That makes sense.
But there was a great one to start things off that came in early from Carrie, asking about the two of you as, a household of two writers. She asked, are you each other's best or worst critic? And I would love to sort of tag on that also, like, what is your relationship to each other's writing like?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Do you want to start?
Well, I have to, all I can say is that I'm the luckiest person in the world, because every step of the way, Matthew is someone who is kind and encouraging, and anyone who knows that would say that, and anyone who's ever reached out to him as an author would say that. And it's a very rare quality for someone to just be endlessly giving. So I feel very, very, very lucky that my biggest supporter is my husband. And I think when you have that in a partnership, it kind of trickles down to the kids. And, our kids are also very encouraging of our work. And I hope I can kind of offer that right back to Matthew. But we're very lucky that every day I get to learn something new and talk about something new and think about ideas in new ways. And I hope that's something everyone has in their lives, because whether it's with friend or community members or in your local bookstore, it's those simple pleasures of having a good conversation. And I always think of myself not as a writer, this is my first book, but as a reader. And I think that quality I have where I just read constantly, I just found my perfect match in someone who writes constantly. And so we're very lucky.
And I always will say that Tobey is so much more of a reader than I am, just a natural reader. I mean, even as a child, I think it took me a while before I took reading very seriously, which I always remind people who are worried their kids aren't reading much at a specific age. It's something that the interest in reading and writing can evolve throughout your life. And I think Tobey's been a big influence on how I write. I in fact have always written fiction, historical fiction, so always research-based, what I've done. But my next book is narrative nonfiction, and kind of with some similar themes as Tobey, and I definitely would attribute that to, I think, at least subconsciously, to wanting to be one of those books that I think Tobey especially gravitates toward, which now I also do, I think, more and more, which is those incredible true stories that almost read like a novel, which is how I would describe Terror to the Wicked, even though it's 100% accurate. The momentum, the pacing, the way that people pop off the page as characters and come to life. I think we're in a real high point, like a real renaissance for the last however many years for that kind of writing. And it really pulls people into these true stories and into these histories. I'm just glad that my experiences and stresses writing and being a writer didn't dissuade Tobey from writing. And I think I would, I think, and for people here, people in your life, it can be a very scary thing to match that desire to try to write with the actual activity of working on a big writing project or even a small writing project. So that can be very intimidating, I think, for a lot of reasons. So I think this is an example of everything you've already talked about, of what I hope could be an inspiration, as it was for me, that you could bring a passion to a project even without a experience with writing this type of project, and really kind of throw yourself into it, even though it is, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it is a scary thing to kind of set out to do.
Sure. No, and I hope, you know, walking away from my job when, as we started to welcome our children, and it was a job I deeply loved. But I did wonder what was ahead. Would I go back to similar work? Would I focus on my kids? And when this story kind of bubbled up in front of me, I couldn't believe it hadn't been told more widely. And no pun intended, but you know, I thought, okay, maybe this is my second chapter. You know, maybe this is something I can try. And I suspect that many people after the pandemic will be considering new chapters in their lives, whether it's professional or otherwise, or just the nature of our economy, where you see young people just trying so many new things and kind of seeing what sticks, what works for them, what they can thrive in. And I feel very grateful that I had kind of the emotional support to take that leap of faith. And I feel forever grateful to my editor, who was willing to take a chance on a first-time debut author. But she was as passionate about the historical events as I was. So I was very lucky to have found that remarkable person who was willing to take this journey with me. And it was a very long journey. I think this all began in 2015, if memory serves, where I started working on the proposal. And now the book is here, and it's 2021. It's been years, but if you find something you're interested in and passionate about, and I think the project matched my mindset and mind space of being middle-aged and a little bit more patient. I don't think I could have done this in my 20s or 30s, but this was the right project at the right time for me. And I hope other people enjoy taking those leaps of faith that sometimes books allow us to do, whether we're writing them or reading them.
So another great question that's come in from the audience is asking why the murder happened. What was the agenda or the purpose or the motive behind it?
That's a great question. Thank you. So indentured servants came to Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay Colony initially hoping for land. They signed contracts that usually lasted for about 7 years, but those contracts could be extended as forms of punishment. So people coming over as indentured servants were usually impoverished, had very limited opportunities, and they were hoping at the completion of their indenturitude that they would have an opportunity to have land. By 1638, that opportunity had pretty much vanished. So people were completing their indenture and maybe would have some clothes, maybe they would receive a suit and little else. And in those intervening years, they would receive very bare bones room and board. And I document the case of one boy who was tortured. And so these were very, very grim conditions that people were working in. And so this group of 4 men, and I should also note, Matthew raised the issue of singledom basically being outlawed in Plymouth Colony, and that's certainly accurate. And in addition to that, if you were an indentured servant, you were living in someone's home, you were not allowed to date, you were not allowed to marry. And these were very young people, teenagers, early 20s. And the idea that they would live in this Puritan way for 7 years, longer, 10 years without dating, without being allowed to marry or have a family was unrealistic. So Arthur Peach had actually impregnated a woman named Dorothy Temple. So this was, as you can imagine, a huge scandal in a Puritan settlement. And she would later be whipped until she passed out for this.
Right after she gave birth.
Right. right after she gave birth. So you have these 4 indentured servants who, perhaps not surprisingly, decide to depart these terrible circumstances that they're in. And they're escaping. They're not allowed to leave. They need permission to leave. They've walked out in the middle of the night onto this trail, and they've made it relatively far south of Plymouth Colony. But pretty quickly, they find themselves lost in the woods without resources, without food. They're near a swamp. It's questionable whether that was really providing sufficient drinking water, but things are not going well for this group of 4. And Arthur Peach is kind of the ringleader of the group. And as I mentioned earlier, he had served as a Pequot War soldier. And when they spot Penewanquist walking through the woods on the first day, they don't interact with him. But that night, it's recorded in the historical records, Arthur Peach says to the other men, "I'm going to kill him and take what he has from him." They know that he is headed to the Uptuxet trading outpost that belonged to Plymouth Colony on Wampanoag land. And they know he's going to be coming back with wampum, which was the currency of the day. It could be used to pay tuition at Harvard. It could be used to buy land. It could be used in any way that you would use currency. It was the first currency dictated by treaty, tripartite treaty. So I described, the currency of the wampum dictated how long it was, the length. So by the time Penewanquist was coming back down the trail, he was carrying a bag, a satchel perhaps, of rattling, noisy, heavy wampum. And I compare it in the book to someone leaving a bank with a bag of gold in a dark alley. He's there by himself on this wooded footpath. It's I love hiking in the woods with my dog. That's something I do all the time, but this is an area, as much site research as I did, this is kind of a creepy area that I even kind of steered clear of. It's lonely, it's dark, and as Roger Williams described it, it's fit for an evil purpose. So you have Penewanquist alone, coming back with this bag of wampum. And the trading treaties of the day dictated that people leave weapons, that they're not welcome at trading outposts with a weapon. So people who otherwise would have been armed were unarmed. And so you have a very vulnerable young man coming back through on this path. And Arthur Peach waves him over when he comes back the second time with his plan already in mind, lying in wait.
Well, don't give everything away.
Well, this is the heart of it, so I'll leave it to readers to.
But I think it's also worth adding, without going into all the details because they're in the book, but there's also a way to look at it as a hate crime. Obviously, that term would not have existed back then, but in addition to needing to fund themselves and their escape, there is this underlying kind of perspective on the value or lack of value of an Indian's life, right, coming from Peach.
Right. So Peach did say hateful words during his crime that were recorded and are there in the historical record. So we can see a little bit into his mindset. And it seems to be the mindset of someone not just desperate, not just hungry, not just poor, but coming from a place of hate.
Right. I see that Lulu, our daughter, asked a question. Rachel, can we go to that one to make sure we fit it in?
Absolutely, yes.
So
Lulu asked, why is the book called Terror to the Wicked?
Oh, that's such a great question, Lulu. Thank you. So the title of the book is the way that the Plymouth Colony governor, Thomas Prince, the judge at trial, was referred to. He was called a terror to the wicked. And I always think of this era, and I've spent a lot of time around Plymouth in this area where these events were set. And there's something succinct about kind of that stark good and evil of the time that people kind of believed in, that I thought these words kind of capture the feeling of the day about good and evil.
There's a question here from Patrick. He says, it kind of touches on the last question we had for Lulu's. Do you think that trying an indentured servants for the murder of an American Indian was as progressive then as it seems to us now? Or was it that indentured servants would have been seen essentially as occupying that same kind of caste, really low, or not the same, but similarly low?
That's a great question. I think that's certainly a way to look at this. There's no question that indentured servants were kind of viewed very low in terms of the settlement hierarchy. And so it's tempting to think, okay, perhaps it was easy enough for the jurors at the trial to say, we're going to hold these 4 men guilty, they're indentured servants. The historical record does not reflect that, though. You have Winthrop reporting this grumbling among the settlers about this idea of 4 people dying for the murder of an American Indian man, and this hubbub and this distress among the settlers. And so the record goes in a different direction there. And
there's a lot you don't expect, right? Because
yes.
some of the tribal chiefs actually advocate not to punish. There's so many complicated cultural values and perspectives that at least one of the chiefs, if I'm remembering right, advocates to not punish the murderer.
Right. Massasoit seeks out Roger Williams. This is the head of the Wampanoag, and has a conversation that's recorded by Roger Williams, in which he comes to Arthur Peach's defense. And that was also an incredible surprise that I had not anticipated. And it was remarkable that the conversation was recorded and that it flew in the face of everything I could have anticipated.
Sorry, I muted myself. There's a question from Judith asking if you had an agent and how the publication process went for you. And we are just about out of time, so I'm afraid that this is our last question.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. And it's a great logistical question because so many people have wonderful ideas for nonfiction books. And as Matthew pointed out, I love reading these very highly narrative, detailed histories that are inclusive histories. And I think the narrative style lends itself to this great degree of detail and uncovering historical figures who up till this point have not been revealed. So I hope anyone who has an idea for telling a history that's been told many times before, but thinks they might be able to tell it in a new and different way, an equitable way, I hope you go for it. And finding an agent is the first step. And there are so many wonderful agents out there, and nonfiction is different than fiction. Nonfiction, you just have to write up a proposal, show your research and why the idea is important, and see if you can find a wonderful agent who is as wonderful as the one I was lucky enough to find, who believed in my project.
And that took a long time, just to say that it could be quick, but usually it's a process that involves a huge amount of patience on your part, and not taking things personally. It's just every agent has different tastes in what they like to read, just like we all do. You wouldn't want an agent who is lukewarm, not about a project or a book, nothing about the quality of something, but just about that type of book, right? It's not their passion. So it took you quite a while to find the right match.
And to write the proposal, that probably took a year and a half, maybe, just to get to that point. And the proposal was probably 30 pages, but to complete that much research to write those 30 pages probably took a year and a half.
That's incredible. It's quite a process. Tobey and Matthew, thank you so much. This has been really a fascinating and lovely evening. Audience, thank you so much for being here and for your continuing support. We really couldn't do it without you, so thank you. And have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
It's
much.
been such
Buy
a
the book.
pleasure.
Yes, you can order the book at northshire.com. I put the link in the chat a few times, and you can also find it in the confirmation email you got with the Zoom link. So have a great night, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank
Lots of love to
you.
Bernita.